Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a really complex and often sensitive topic. The patterns of transactional tourism around the globe.
It's definitely challenging territory.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, our analysis is grounded in some very specific proprietary insights. We're working from the LoopSpeak research brief. This was authored by Devon, published by D Publishing Group, and it's owned by D Investment Enterprise, LLC.
That's right. And it's important to note the approach here. This brief uses a structural analysis, really relying on academic evidence. The goal isn't moral judgment, but understanding the mechanics behind these global exchanges. It's quite distinct in that way.
Which is crucial, I think, for getting past the surface level. So we'll be diving into the regional patterns, the economic forces at play, and especially this very gendered way researchers often frame the whole thing. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission here is really to understand why. Why does the language change so much sex versus romance depending on who the tourist is? And maybe more importantly, what does that difference in framing hide?
That structural viewpoint is key, as you said. McClarty's brief really tries to separate out that economic engine from, the immediate emotional or moral reaction.
Right.
It argues that's really the only path to figuring out meaningful policy approaches. You have to understand the how first.
It's tough separating morality from topics like this,
Yeah.
but I get the point. Analyze the structure before jumping to conclusions. So structure first. What does the brief identify as the absolute core driver?
Okay, the core driver is immediate and clear, and this is where the LoopSpeak research really provides focus. Fundamentally, it's economic inequality. Overwhelmingly, it's presented less as a cultural phenomenon and more as a structural economic one.
Right. Not about culture primarily, but about money.
Exactly. What's fascinating here, and the source really lays this out, is the sheer scale of the financial gap. You have tourists from wealthy, high GDP countries interacting with service providers in developing nations where, the earning potential, the cost of living is just vastly different. This huge economic disparity creates the entire foundation. It essentially fuels the whole system.
Which leads right into this really provocative question the brief raises. It basically asks, could wealth inequality itself be the global aphrodisiac?
That's a powerful framing.
It really is. It reframes the whole thing away from just desire or companionship and puts financial power front and center. It makes you wonder, if that wealth gap just vanished, would these interactions still happen on the same scale? Brief seems to suggest probably not.
Precisely. If financial power is the engine, then the next step the research explores is how gender acts as a filter for that power. And that filtering leads to this well-known dichotomy you mentioned, sex tourism versus romance tourism. Though the source is quick to warn that this common distinction, it simplifies things quite a bit.
Okay, let's break down those two flows, men. Starting with what's usually called sex tourism, typically male tourists. Where does the research say this is most concentrated?
Primarily, you see heavy concentration in Latin America. The brief cites places like Costa Rica, Brazil, Mexico, and also significantly across Southeast Asia. And in these cases, the power dynamic is framed pretty explicitly around financial dominance. The exchange tends to be more direct, transactional. It reflects that economic upper hand.
Okay, so male dynamic, financial power, Latin America, Southeast Asia. But the female-driven side, that follows a different map, doesn't it? Why the geographical difference there?
It does. Female tourism, often labeled romance tourism, tends to be more visible in different geographical areas. Think the Caribbean, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic are mentioned, and also parts of Africa like Kenya and Gambia.
Interesting. Different continents, different regions.
Yes, and the source suggests part of this shift might relate to existing cultural ideas, maybe different service expectations in those areas. For the female-driven pattern, the power base identified isn't just wealth. It's described as a mix of emotional leverage plus wealth. So the framing shifts towards seeking companionship, attention, intimacy, alongside the financial transaction. There's often an expectation of, emotional performance.
Ah, okay. And the LoopSpeak analysis actually adds the third category, right? To sort of challenge that strict binary, the adventure freedom idea.
That's right. It's presented as a non-gender specific framing.
So how does that one work? Is it like people stepping outside their usual social class or constraints while traveling?
Exactly. This adventure freedom framing is seen as existing potentially everywhere. It's driven by class mobility. For the local service provider, regardless of their gender, it can be a way to access resources, a lifestyle, maybe opportunities they wouldn't normally have. It's a form of temporary class movement. And for the tourist, it can be about escaping their own social roles or restrictions back home. So it's this kind of escape valve powered by the economic difference on both sides.
That really highlights the core issue, doesn't it? The transaction might be similar, but the language we wrap around it changes everything. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We have to ask that question the source poses. Why do we tend to call it romance when women are the tourists, but sex when men are? Is it just semantics, or is that too simplistic?
Well, the source argues it's a profound linguistic difference, yes, but suggests it functions partly as a coping mechanism, perhaps for the tourist, and maybe a marketing strategy for the destination. The research really digs into how this romance versus sex labeling can obscure some key shared dynamics underneath.
Like what specifically?
Two main things. First, it often hides the very real female economic power. The female tourist's wealth is driving the interaction, regardless of the romantic framing she or the provider might prefer.
Her money is still the key enabler.
Absolutely. And second, and this is really important, it can obscure the male emotional vulnerability often involved. Particularly for male service providers, say in the Caribbean or parts of Africa, there's often an expectation of performing emotional labor,
Performing? How so?
providing validation, confidence, being the attentive partner, listening. It's a kind of performance. And the brief suggests this emotional work can be exhausting, demanding, and it's required to get the financial benefit. It's labor.
Wow, so the romance framing hides both the woman's financial power and the man's emotional labor or vulnerability.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yes.
yes, focusing just on romance lets everyone, maybe policymakers included, sidestep the fact that both patterns are fundamentally rooted in that same economic imbalance. The emotional part becomes a required service, not necessarily the primary motivation for the exchange itself.
That imbalance is always there. Two sides of the same coin, really, just packaged differently. And it brings us back to that core question from the brief. Are these encounters truly about love or power or simply survival?
Mm-hmm.
And the McClarty analysis also points out something else important, how race and specific cultural images play a role, right? Shaping fantasies and demand.
Yes, absolutely. The projection of certain stereotypes, like the dreadlocked lover image sometimes associated with the Caribbean, or specific ideas about Latino women in Latin America, these images add another layer. They influence not just who participates, but also what kinds of fantasies or roles people are essentially paid to perform. It complicates the power dynamic even further.
Which brings us to the really difficult part, the ethical side, and how policymakers should even approach this. The brief stresses a critical technical distinction first, doesn't it?
Critically important, yes. The sources are adamant. Trafficking is not the same as tourism. Trafficking involves force, fraud, coercion. It's a grave human rights violation needing urgent criminal justice responses. The tourism discussed here, while definitely exploitative because it leverages inequality, is defined by exchanges between consenting adults, driven by economic factors.
That distinction is absolutely vital for policy. You see organizations like the UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and the ILO, the International Labor Organization. Their work has to focus on combating that coercion, the trafficking aspect. They have to separate it from consensual, albeit unequal, economic exchanges to be effective.
Exactly. If you conflate the two, your policy responses will likely fail.
So, given that distinction, what are the core policy challenges the LoopSpeak document highlights? It argues against just focusing on morality, right?
Correct. It argues that any effective analysis has to focus on structural poverty as the root cause. Focusing only on morality can lead to, well, moralizing without actually addressing the underlying economic conditions that drive people into these situations.
So it's about strategy, not just judgment. What strategies does the brief outline?
It lays out three main pathways governments or organizations tend to consider. First, there's criminalization, just banning the exchanges.
Okay, but what's the risk there?
The risk is driving it further underground. That can make monitoring impossible, potentially increase risks for service providers, violence, exploitation, without actually removing the economic need.
Right, it doesn't fix the poverty. What's the second path?
Regulation. This could mean things like licensing, maybe health standards, trying to ensure fairer compensation.
But that sounds difficult too, especially in places with weak enforcement or potential corruption.
Extremely challenging, yes. Which leads to the third path, and the one McClarty's analysis suggests might be the most fundamental, focusing on creating viable alternative economic opportunities.
Addressing the root cause.
Exactly. Investing in local education, infrastructure, developing sustainable industries outside of tourism. Basically giving people better options so they aren't dependent on transactional tourism for survival. It targets the engine, that economic inequality, instead of just managing the symptom.
Okay, so let's try to summarize this complex picture. Based on our deep dive into the McClarty brief, What are the main takeaways for someone trying to understand this? First, I'd say, economic inequality is the absolute bedrock. It's the engine driving these global transactions, that idea of it being the global aphrodisiac.
Definitely number one.
Second, this whole dynamic gets filtered through a very strong gendered lens. We use different words. Sex is for men, romance for women, and that language difference hides crucial realities. The woman's economic power, and often the man's emotional labor or vulnerability.
Agreed. The labels obscured the shared foundation.
And finally, these patterns aren't random. They show up in distinct geographical hotspots. Latin America and Southeast Asia for male tourists, the Caribbean and parts of Africa more for female tourists, often linked to specific cultural narratives or fantasies.
Those patterns are quite clear in the data presented, and maybe a final thought, drawing from the brief. We really need to think about what happens when a local economy becomes deeply structurally dependent on this kind of sexualized tourism. When it becomes one of the few, or maybe the only, reliable way for people to make a living, well, then it stops being just about individual transactions. It becomes a symptom of much larger global economic failures. Failures in how resources and opportunities are distributed.
That idea of structural dependence is powerful. And it leaves us with a final, quite challenging question for you, the listener, to think about. How much responsibility do wealthier nations actually bear? Responsibility for either trying to regulate these exchanges more effectively, or perhaps more profoundly, for actively investing in and helping create the conditions, the alternative opportunities, that would make transactional tourism less of a necessary survival strategy in the first place. Something to consider. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.